I left Australia 30 years ago. I was a journalist here, went to Canada, was a journalist there for 15 years, and then got lured into this work with Ecotrust, which is based in Portland, Oregon. They hired me to start the Canadian operation, and I ran that for 15 years. And basically, we worked in remote indigenous communities, working on what we call knowledge systems, helping them actually understand what's happening where they live, what's been happening to their country, what's happening to the resources, and helping them to come to decision-making tables about resource development, much better equipped than they'd been in the past. And we call that work information democracy. It's really sort of trying to level the playing field for communities to have a fair go when decisions are made about what's happening on country. And then the other part of our work was basically about what we'd really call the democratisation of credit, which is how do you, when people do have some say over what's happening on country, how do you help them develop assets so they can participate in the economic outcomes on their country? So getting them into sustainable fisheries, sustainable forestry was a big issue up in North America and the Pacific Northwest, renewable energy. There's all sorts of fields in remote areas where Indigenous people can be involved in economic development and in asset development right where they live.
Now, I think for any Australian, we would be very familiar with the sort of challenges you have with Indigenous communities. Less familiar with what you're talking about, this democratisation in terms of capital and the work of social finance. So how do you go about this? This is actually creating capital for Indigenous communities to undertake enterprises. Is that it?
Yes, that's part of what we've done. Yeah. And when you think about it, so in Northern Australia, for instance, where Ecotrust, in our initial forays here, we're going to be concentrating mostly in the north, the Indigenous people in Northern Australia own around 44% of the land, or control or own 44% of the land mass north of the 26th parallel. So right away, the Indigenous people in this country actually have a very significant underlying capital base in the land that they own. It's not necessarily released in conventional economic terms, but they have a tremendous amount of assets.
Owned collectively.
Owned collectively. And so in some cases our work was working with Indigenous collectives, and in some cases it was working with individual entrepreneurs. We set up in Canada a revolving loan fund modelled on a US example. In the US we also helped to start the world's first environmental bank.
That's Shore Bank Pacific.
That's Shore Bank Pacific.
Well, let me ask you, because I was reading your blurb about Shore Bank Pacific, and it says it turned $60 million worth of grants, I think, into $300 million capital. Now, that sounds like magic to me, so how do you do it?
Well, it's the grants that have come to Ecotrust over the years. We've leveraged those into other grants to either other community organisations, or have actually raised capital which has then been relent. So we have a sort of a multiplier. Actually, it's usually about 7 to 1 on some of the work that we've done. But basically, I think there's a psychology that Indigenous people, they're in remote communities, they're disadvantaged, they have no assets, they have no capability, they can't be part of the mainstream. And so the sort of closing the gap mentality that is current in this country is, well, how do we bring them into the mainstream? Well, that will work so much, it seems to me. The fact is, I don't think Australians want to clear the country out of people altogether. This is already the most urbanised country in the world, and I don't think we want to look forward to a future where everyone has to live in the cities, or Indigenous people all have to move to these growth towns. I think, and there's evidence that shows, even in Australia, that investing in people to do productive work on their own country actually produces tremendous health and social outcomes, and actually saves the government money. The Menzies School of Health Research just released a report a little while ago that actually proved there's a link between investing in people on country and their health and social outcomes. And
so your hope, and in fact your experience, is you will be able to harness through loans or equity capital which can go into individual or community enterprise?
We hope so. So there's a sort of a design and development phase that we're in right now, because
Brooke and I have talked quite a lot on this program about social impact bonds. Does that fit in at all?
Perfectly good example. And actually, when Sir Ronald Cohen was here recently from the UK Social Investment Task Force, I talked to him about a social impact bond for Indigenous Australia. He's quite enthusiastic. The point is, I think, is that it takes a while to design something bespoke, if you will, well for the Australian market, and the Australian issues aren't all exactly the same as the Canadian issues. But the point is that the Indigenous people themselves have this underlying asset in the land. They actually, in some cases, actually have quite a lot of capital because they've been the beneficiaries of resource royalty agreements.
Well, that's last question. They've had royalties, or not all communities, a number have had, and yet it hasn't turned into that enterprise. I mean, is the royalty model failed?
I think the royalty model's failed not because royalties per se are a bad thing, but how they're gathered and who manages them and what they manage them for, I think are at fault. So I think there's an innovation space that we're really willing to explore here. I don't think we have a sort of silver bullet, but I absolutely believe that investing in people in place is something that Australians need to pay very careful attention to.
And Ian, just finally, again, in your blurb, you talk of trying to make a breakthrough contribution. What does breakthrough actually mean to you then?
Well,
I
think we need to find ways in which Indigenous people actually co-invest with others in a positive future. I also think, we spend over $4 billion a year in this country on the Indigenous file. Almost none of that goes to economic development, and almost none of it goes to what I would call caring for country initiatives, which are focused on keeping people doing something productive where they live.
Great story, Ian. All power to your elbow.
Thanks very much.